Antony, 44 to 30 B.C. 1. Antony and Brutus. The assassination of Caesar was one of the major tragedies of history, not merely in the sense that it interrupted a great labor of statesmanship and led to 15 years more of chaos and war. Civilization survived, and Augustus completed what Caesar had begun. It was a tragedy also in the sense that probably both parties were right. The conspirators in thinking that Caesar meditated monarchy, Caesar in thinking that disorder and empire had made monarchy inevitable. Men have divided on the issue ever since the Senate sat for a moment in consternation at the deed, and then fled in tumult and terror from the hall. Antony, arriving after the event, saw valor in discretion and fortified himself in his house. Cicero's eloquence lost its tongue, even when Brutus, dagger in hand, hailed him as father of his country. Emerging, the conspirators found an excited populace in the square. They tried to win it with catchwords of liberty and the republic, but the dazed crowd had no homage for phrases so long used to cover greed. Fearing for their lives, the assassins took refuge in the buildings on the Capitol and surrounded themselves there with their personal gladiatorial guards. Toward evening, Cicero joined them. Antony, approached by their emissaries, sent a friendly reply. The next day a larger crowd gathered in the Forum. The conspirators sent agents to buy its support and organize it into a legal assembly. Then they ventured down from the Capitol, and Brutus delivered an oration which he had prepared for the Senate. The speech failed to move its hearers. Cassius tried and was met with cold silence. The liberators returned to the Capitol, and as the crowd thinned out they stealthily departed to their homes. Antony, thinking himself Caesar's heir, obtained from the stunned Calpurnia all the papers and funds that the dictator had left in his palace. At the same time he secretly summoned Caesar's veterans to Rome. On the 17th, by his authority as tribune, he convened the Senate and astonished all parties by his amiability and calm. He accepted Cicero's proposal for a general amnesty and agreed that Brutus and Cassius should receive provincial governorships, i.e., flight with safety and power, on condition that the Senate should ratify all the decrees, legislation, and appointments of Caesar. Since a majority of the Senate owed office or emoluments to these acts, it consented, and when it adjourned, Antony was acclaimed as a statesman who had snatched peace out of the jaws of war. That evening he entertained Cassius for dinner. On the 18th, the Senate met again, recognized Caesar's will, voted him a public funeral, and appointed Antony to deliver the customary eulogy. On the 19th, Antony secured the will from the Vestal virgins with whom it had been deposited, and read it, first to a small, then to a larger gathering. It bequeathed Caesar's private fortune to 3 grandnephews, and, to the astonishment and anger of Antony, named one of them, Caius Octavius, as adoptive son and heir. The dictator had devised his gardens to the people as a public park, and had left 300 sesterces to every citizen of Rome. The news of these benefactions spread through the city, and when, on the 20th, Caesar's body, which had been embalmed in his home, was brought into the Forum for the last rites, a great concourse of people, including Caesar's veterans, gathered to do him reverence. Antony seems to have spoken at first with cautious restraint, but as he went on, his pent-up feelings flared into eloquence. When he raised from the ivory bier the torn and bloody robe through which Caesar had been stabbed, the emotions of the crowd were stirred beyond control. Amid weird wailing and frenzied cries, men gathered wood anywhere and built a fire beneath the corpse. Veterans threw their weapons upon the pyre as an offering. Actors threw their costumes, musicians their instruments, women their most precious ornaments. Taking brands from the fire, some enthusiasts sought to burn down the houses of the conspirators. But these buildings were well guarded, and their masters had fled from Rome. A large part of the crowd stayed all night long by the smoldering pyre. Many Jews, grateful for Caesar's sympathetic legislation, remained there 3 days, intoning their ancient funeral chants. During those days, riots surged through the capital. At last Antony directed his soldiers to restore order and to fling persistent marauders from the Tarpeian Rock. Antony was one half of what Caesar had been, as Augustus would be the other half. Antony was a good general, Augustus a superlative statesman. Neither would be both. Born in 82 B.C., Antony had spent a large part of his life in camps and more in the quest of wine, women, good food, and fun. Though of high lineage and handsome features, he had the characteristic virtues of the common man: strength of body, animal spirits, good nature, generosity, courage, and loyalty. He had scandalized even Caesar by keeping a harem of both sexes in Rome and traveling with a Greek courtesan in his litter. He had bought in Pompey's house at auction, occupied it, and then refused payment. Now he found in Caesar's papers, or, some said, placed there, whatever it suited him to find: appointments for his friends, decrees for his purposes, perquisites for himself. In 2 weeks' time he had paid off $1,500,000 in debts and had become a rich man. He seized the $25 million that Caesar had deposited in the Temple of Ops and took another $5 million from Caesar's private treasury. Noting that Decimus Brutus, whom Caesar had appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul, had assumed that lucrative office despite sharing in the assassination of Caesar, Antony passed through the assembly a bill giving himself that strategic province and consoling Decimus with Macedonia. Likewise, Marcus Brutus and Cassius were to surrender Macedonia to Decimus and Syria to Dolabella, and were to content themselves with sharing Cyrene and Crete. Alarmed by Antony's spreading power, the Senate invited to Rome, as a foil to him, Caesar's adopted son. Caius Octavius, who was to make himself the greatest statesman in Roman history, was 18 years old in 44. By natural custom he took his adoptive father's name. Adding to his own as a modifier, he became Caius Julius Caesar Octavianus, until, 17 years later, he received that lofty name of Augustus by which the centuries have known him. His grandmother was Caesar's sister Julia. His grandfather had been a banker of plebeian stock at Velitrae in Latium. His father had served as plebeian aedile, then praetor, then governor of Macedonia. The boy was trained to Spartan simplicity and educated in the literature and philosophy of Greece and Rome. In the last 3 years he had lived a good part of the time in Caesar's palace. It was one of the sorrows of Caesar's life that he had no legitimate son, and one of his profoundest insights that he adopted Octavius. He took the boy with him to Spain in 45, and was pleased to see the courage with which the frail and nervous invalid endured the perils and hardships of the campaign. He had him carefully instructed in the arts of war and government. Many statues have made his features familiar: refined, delicate, serious, at once diffident and resolute, yielding and tenacious. An idealist forced to be a realist, a man of thought painfully learning to be a man of action. He was thin and pale and suffered from a poor digestion. He ate little, drank less, and outlived the strong men around him by abstinence and the regularity of his life. Late in March of 44, a freedman arrived at Apollonia, in Illyria, where Octavian was stationed with the army, and brought the news of Caesar's death and will. The sensitive youth was horrified at men's ingratitude. All his love for the great-uncle who had so cherished him and had worked so feverishly to rebuild a shattered state welled up in him and filled him with a silent resolve to complete the labors of Caesar and avenge his death. He rode down to the sea, crossed to Brundisium, and hastened to Rome. His relatives there advised him to stay in hiding lest Antony destroy him. His mother likewise recommended inaction, but when he scorned such a course she rejoiced, merely suggesting that whenever possible he should use patience and subtlety rather than open war. He followed this wise counsel to the end. He visited Antony and inquired what was being done against Caesar's enemies. He was shocked to find Antony busy planning to lead an army against Decimus Brutus, who had refused to surrender Cisalpine Gaul. He asked Antony to disburse Caesar's legacies according to will, especially the $45 bequeathed to every citizen. Antony saw many reasons for delay. Octavian thereupon distributed the money to Caesar's veterans, out of funds borrowed by him from Caesar's friends, and with this approach organized his own army. Infuriated by the insolence of this boy, as he called him, Antony announced that an attempt had been made upon his life, and that the would-be assassin had named Octavian as the instigator of his plan. Octavian protested his innocence. Cicero took advantage of the quarrel to persuade him that Antony was a ruffian who must be defeated. Octavian agreed, joined his 2 legions with those of the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, and marched with them northward to battle Antony. Cicero lent this new civil war the aid of his invective in 14 powerful philippics against the public policy and private life of Antony, some delivered to the Senate or the Assembly, the rest published as propaganda broadcasts in the best tradition of martial blackening. In the ensuing engagement at Modena, Antony lost and fled, 44. But Hirtius and Pansa fell, and Octavian returned to Rome sole commander of the Senate's legions as well as his own. With this force behind him, he compelled the Senate to name him consul, to repeal its amnesty to the conspirators, and to sentence them all to death. Discovering that Cicero and the Senate were now his enemies and were merely using him as a temporary tool against Antony, he composed his differences with Antony and formed with him and Lepidus the Second Triumvirate, 43 to 33. Their combined armies marched into Rome and took it without resistance. Many of the senators and conservatives fled to South Italy and the provinces. The Assembly ratified the triumvirate and gave it full power for 5 years. To pay their troops, replenish their coffers, and revenge Caesar, the 3 men now let loose the bloodiest reign of terror in Roman history. They listed 300 senators and 2,000 businessmen for execution, and offered 25,000 drachmas, $15,000, to any freeman, and 10,000 to any slave who would bring in the head of a person proscribed. To have money became a capital crime. Children to whom fortunes had been left were condemned and killed. Widows were shorn of their legacies. 1,400 rich women were required to turn over a large share of their property to the triumvirs. At last even the savings deposited with the Vestal Virgins were seized. Atticus was spared because he had helped Antony's wife Fulvia. While acknowledging the courtesy, he sent great sums to Brutus and Cassius. The triumvirs set their soldiers to guard all exits from the city. The proscribed hid in wells, sewers, attics, chimneys. Some died resisting, some submitted quietly to their slayers. Some starved, hanged, or drowned themselves. Some leaped from a roof or into a fire. Some were killed by mistake. Some, not proscribed, committed suicide on the bodies of slain relatives. Salvius the tribune, knowing himself doomed, gave a last feast to his friends. The emissaries of the triumvirs entered, cut off his head, left his body at the table, and bade the feast go on. Slaves took the opportunity to get rid of hard masters, but many fought to the death to protect their owners. One disguised himself as his master and suffered decapitation in his stead. Sons died to protect their fathers, others betrayed their fathers to inherit a part of their fortunes. Adulterers or deceived wives surrendered their husbands. The wife of Coponius secured his safety by sleeping with Antony. Antony's wife, Fulvia, had tried to buy the mansion of her neighbor Rufus. He had refused to sell. Now, though he offered it to her as a gift, she had him proscribed and nailed his severed head to his front door. Antony placed Cicero high on the list of those who should be killed. Antony was the husband of Clodius's widow and the stepson of the Catilinarian Lentulus, whom Cicero had slain in jail. and he resented with some reason the unstinted vituperation of the Philippics. Octavian protested, but not too long. He could not forget Cicero's glorification of Caesar's assassins, and the pun by which that reckless wit had excused to the conservatives his dalliance with Caesar's heir. Cicero had said of Octavian, laudandum adolescentum, ordandum tolendum. The boy is to be praised, decorated, and exalted, but tolendum also meant to be killed. Cicero tried to escape, but being buffeted and sickened by the sea, he disembarked and spent the night in his villa at Formii. The next day he wished to stay there and await his executioners, preferring them to a choppy sea. But his slaves forced him into a litter and were carrying him toward the ship, when Antony's soldiers came upon them. The servants wished to resist, but Cicero bade them set the litter down and yield. Then, his person covered with dust, his beard and hair untrimmed, and his face worn with his troubles, he stretched his head out so that the soldiers might more conveniently decapitate him. By Antony's command, Cicero's right hand was also cut off and brought with the head to the triumvir. Antony laughed in triumph, gave the assassins 250,000 drachmas, and had head and hand hung up in the forum. Early in 42, the triumvirs led their forces across the Adriatic and marched through Macedonia into Thrace. There, Brutus and Cassius had massed the last Republican army, financed by exactions beyond even Roman precedent. From the eastern cities of the empire they demanded and received 10 years' taxes in advance. When the Rhodians proved reluctant, Cassius stormed the great port, ordered all citizens to surrender their wealth, killed those who hesitated, and carried away $10 million. In Cilicia he quartered his soldiers in the homes of Tarsus till it paid him $9 million to leave. To raise this sum the citizens auctioned off all municipal lands, melted down all temple vessels and ornaments, and sold free persons into slavery, first boys and girls, then women and old men, finally youths. Many, on learning that they had been sold, killed themselves. In Judea, Cassius levied $4,200,000 and sold the inhabitants of 4 towns into slavery. Brutus, too, could raise money by force. When the citizens of Lycian Xanthus refused his demands, he besieged them until, starving but obdurate, they committed suicide en masse. For the most part, Brutus, loving philosophy, tarried in Athens. But the city was filling with young Roman nobles clamoring for a war of restoration. When sufficient funds had been raised, Brutus closed his books, joined his troops with those of Cassius, and took the field. The rival armies met at Philippi in September of 42. Brutus's wing forced back Octavian's and captured his camp, but Antony's routed the legions of Cassius. Cassius ordered his shield-bearer to kill him and was obeyed. Antony could not follow up his success at once. Octavian was confined to his tent with illness, and his troops were in disorder. Antony reorganized the whole army, and after a few days' rest led them against Brutus, and put the last remnants of the Republican forces to flight. Seeing his men yield, Brutus realized, perhaps with relief, that all was lost. He threw himself upon the sword of a friend and died. Antony, coming upon the body, covered it with his own purple robe. They had once been friends. 2. Antony and Cleopatra. The old aristocracy fought its last land battle at Philippi. Many of them, Cato's son, Hortensius's son, Quintilius Varus, and Quintus Labeo, joined Brutus and Cassius in suicide. The victors divided the empire between them. Lepidus was given Africa, Octavian took the west, Antony, having his choice, took Egypt, Greece, and the east. Always needing money, Antony forgave the eastern cities their contributions to his enemies on condition that they give him a like sum, 10 years' taxes within a year. His old geniality returned as victory made him seemingly secure. He reduced his demands upon the Ephesians when their women, dressed as bacchantes, greeted him as the god Dionysus. but he gave his cook the house of a Magnesian magnate as reward for a distinguished supper. He called an assembly of the Ionian cities at Ephesus, and settled the boundaries and affairs of these states with such good judgment that Augustus, a decade later, found little to change. He pardoned all who had fought against him except those who had shared in killing Caesar. He gave relief to the cities that had suffered most severely from Cassius and Brutus, released several of them from every Roman tax, freed many who had been sold into slavery by the conspirators, and liberated the cities of Syria from the despots who had overthrown their democracies. While displaying these graces of his simple character, Antony surrendered to such exuberant sensuality that his subjects lost respect for his authority. He surrounded himself with dancers, musicians, courtesans, and roisterers, and took wives and concubines whenever a fair woman struck his Olympian fancy. He had sent messengers to bid Cleopatra present herself before him at Tarsus, and answer charges that she had aided Cassius to raise money and troops. She came, but in her own time and way. While Antony sat on a throne in the Forum, waiting for her to plead and be judged, she sailed up the river Cydnus in a barge with purple sails, gilded stern, and silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. Her maids, dressed as sea-nymphs and graces, were the crew, while she herself, dressed as Venus, lay under a canopy of cloth of gold. When the news of this seductive apparition spread among the people of Tarsus, they flocked to the shore, leaving Antony solitary on his throne. Cleopatra invited him to dine with her on her ship. He came with an overawing retinue. She feted them with every luxury and corrupted his generals with gifts and smiles. Antony had almost fallen in love with her as a girl in Alexandria. Now he found her at 29 in the full maturity of her charms. He began by reproving her and ended by presenting her with Phoenicia, Cilicia, Cyprus, and parts of Arabia, Cilicia, and Judea. She rewarded him according to his desire, and invited him to Alexandria. There he spent a carefree winter, 41 to 40, drinking the queen's love, listening to lectures at the museum, and forgetting that he had an empire to rule. She herself was not in love. She knew that Egypt, rich but weak, would soon attract the cupidity of omnipotent Rome. The only salvation for her country and her throne lay in marriage with Rome's lord. She had sought this with Caesar. She sought it now with Antony, and he, who had no policy but Caesar's, was tempted to realize the dream of uniting Rome and Egypt and making his capital in the fascinating East. While Antony frolicked in Alexandria, his wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius were plotting to overthrow Octavian's power in Rome. Octavian had found no happiness there. The Senate was a rump of adventurers and generals. Labor was restless with unemployment. The populares were disorganized. Sextus Pompey was blocking the import of food. Business was petrified with fear. Taxation and spoliation had ruined nearly every fortune, and many men were living in a reckless and sensual riot on the ground that the morrow might in any case bring repudiation of the currency, or further spoliation, or death. Octavian himself was anything but an exemplar of chastity at this time. To perfect the confusion, Fulvia and Lucius raised an army and called upon Italy to oust him. Marcus Agrippa, Octavian's general, besieged Lucius in Perugia and starved him out. March 40. Fulvia died of illness, frustrated ambition, and grief over Antony's neglect of her. Octavian pardoned Lucius in the hope of maintaining peace with Antony, but Antony crossed the sea and besieged Octavian's troops in Brundisium. The armies, showing more sense than their leaders, refused to fight each other and compelled them to a peaceable agreement. 40. As a pledge of good behavior, Antony married Octavian's sister, the gentle and virtuous Octavia. Everybody was briefly happy, and Virgil, writing now his 4th eclogue, predicted the return of Saturn's utopian reign. In 38, Octavian fell in love with Livia, the pregnant wife of Tiberius Claudius Nero. He divorced his first wife, Scribonia, persuaded Nero to release Livia, married her, and found in her persuasive counsel and her aristocratic connections as a member of the Claudian gens a passage to reconciliation with the propertied classes. He reduced taxes, returned 30,000 runaway slaves to their masters, and set himself patiently to restoring order in Italy. With the help of Agrippa, and of 120 ships contributed by Antony, he destroyed the fleet of Sextus Pompey, secured Rome's food supply, and ended the resistance of the Pompeians. 36. The Senate, by acclamation, named him tribune for life. After marrying Octavia in a state ceremony at Rome, Antony went with her to Athens. There, for a time, he enjoyed the novel experience of living with a good woman. He put aside politics and war, and, with Octavia at his side, attended the lectures of philosophers. Meanwhile, however, he studied the plans that Caesar had left for conquering Parthia. Labienus, son of Caesar's general, had entered the services of the Parthian king, and had led Parthian armies victoriously into Cilicia and Syria, lucrative provinces of Rome. 40. To meet this threat, Antony needed soldiers. To pay soldiers, he needed money, and of this Cleopatra had plenty. Suddenly tiring of virtue and peace, he sent Octavia back to Rome and asked Cleopatra to meet him at Antioch. She brought him a few troops, but she disapproved of his grandiose plans and apparently gave him little of her fabulous treasury. He invaded Parthia with 100,000 men, 36, tried in vain to capture its citadels, and lost almost half his forces in a heroic retreat through 300 miles of hostile country. On the way, he annexed Armenia to the empire. He awarded himself a triumph and shocked Italy by celebrating it at Alexandria. He sent a letter of divorce to Octavia, 32, married Cleopatra, confirmed her and Caesarion as joint rulers of Egypt and Cyprus, and bequeathed the eastern provinces of the empire to the son and daughter that Cleopatra had borne him. Knowing that he would soon have to square accounts with Octavian, he abandoned himself to a year of frolic and luxury. Cleopatra encouraged him to dare the last gamble for omnipotence, helped him to raise an army and a fleet, and chose as her favorite oath, "As surely as I shall one day give judgment in the Capitol." 3. Antony and Octavian. Octavia bore her rejection silently, lived quietly in Antony's house at Rome, and brought up faithfully his children by Fulvia and the 2 daughters that she herself had given him. The daily sight of her mute desolation inflamed Octavian's conviction that both Italy and he were doomed if Antony's plans succeeded. He saw to it that Italy should realize the situation. Antony had married the Queen of Egypt, had assigned to her and her illegitimate offspring the most tribute-yielding of Rome's provinces, was seeking to make Alexandria the capital of the empire, and would reduce Rome and Italy to subordinate roles. When Antony sent a message to the Senate, which he had for years ignored, proposing that he and Octavian should retire to private life, and that the institutions of the Republic should be restored, Octavian escaped a difficult situation by reading to the Senate what he claimed was Antony's will, which he had taken by force from the Vestal Virgins. It named Antony's children by Cleopatra, his sole heirs, and directed that he should be buried beside the Queen in Alexandria. The last clause was as decisive for the Senate as it should have proved suspicious. Instead of raising doubts that a will filed in Rome should have made such provisions, it convinced the Senate and Italy that Cleopatra was scheming to absorb the empire through Antony. With characteristic subtlety, Octavian declared war, 32, against her rather than Antony, and made the conflict a holy war for the independence of Italy. In September 32, the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra sailed into the Ionian Sea, 500 warships strong. No such armada had been seen before. Supporting it was an army of 100,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, mostly supplied by eastern princes and kings in the hope of making this a war of liberation from Rome. Octavian crossed the Adriatic with 400 vessels, 80,000 foot, 12,000 horse. For almost a year the rival forces prepared and maneuvered. Then on September 2nd, 31, they fought at Actium in the Ambracian Gulf, one of the decisive battles of history. Agrippa proved the better tactician, and his light ships more manageable than Antony's heavy-towered leviathans. Many of these were consumed by fires set by burning brands cast upon them by Octavian's crews. Some sailors, says Dio Cassius, perished by the smoke before the flames could reach them. Others were cooked in their armor, which became red-hot. Others were roasted in their vessels as though in ovens. Many leaped into the sea. Of these, some were mangled by sea monsters, some were shot by arrows, some were drowned. The only ones to obtain an endurable death were those who killed one another. Antony saw that he was losing and signaled to Cleopatra to carry out their prearranged plan for retreat. She headed her squadron southward and waited for Antony. Unable to extricate his flagship, he abandoned it and rowed out to hers. As they sailed for Alexandria, he sat alone on the prow, his head between his hands, conscious that everything was lost, even honor. From Actium, Octavian went to Athens, thence to Italy to quell a mutiny among his troops, who clamored for the plunder of Egypt, then to Asia to depose and punish Antony's adherents, and raise new funds from long-suffering cities. Then to Alexandria, 30. Antony had left Cleopatra and was staying on an island near Pharos. Thence he sent offers of peace, which Octavian ignored. Unknown to Antony, Cleopatra sent Octavian a golden scepter, crown, and throne as tokens of her submission. According to Dio, he replied that he would leave her and Egypt untouched if she would kill Antony. The beaten triumvir wrote to Octavian again, reminding him of their former friendship and of all the wanton pranks in which they had shared as youths, and agreed to kill himself if the victor would spare Cleopatra. Again Octavian made no reply. Cleopatra gathered all that she could of the Egyptian treasury into a palace tower and informed Octavian that she would destroy it all, and herself, unless he granted an honorable peace. Antony led what small forces remained to him in a last fight. His desperate courage won a temporary victory. But on the next day, seeing Cleopatra's mercenaries surrender and receiving a report that Cleopatra was dead, he stabbed himself. When he learned that the report was false, he begged to be brought to the tower in whose upper chambers the queen and her attendants had locked themselves. They drew him up through the window, and he died in her arms. Octavian allowed her to come forth and bury her lover. Then he granted her an audience, and, immune to what lure survived in a broken woman of 39, he gave her terms that made life seem worthless to one who had been a queen. Convinced that he intended to take her as captive to adorn a Roman triumph, she arrayed herself in her royal robes, put an asp to her breast, and died. Her handmaidens, Charmian and Iris, followed her in suicide. Octavian permitted her to be buried beside Antony. Caesarion, and Antony's eldest son by Fulvia, he slew. The children of Antony and the queen he spared and sent to Italy, where Octavia reared them as if they were her own. The victor found the Egyptian treasury intact and as abundant as he had dreamed. Egypt escaped the indignity of being named a Roman province. Octavian merely mounted the throne of the Ptolemies, succeeded to their possessions, and left a praefectus to administer the country in his name. Caesar's heir had conquered those of Alexander and absorbed Alexander's realm. The West, again, as at Marathon and Magnesia, had triumphed over the East. The battle of the giants was over, and an invalid had won. The Republic died at Pharsalus. The Revolution ended at Actium. Rome had completed the fatal cycle known to Plato and to us. Monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchic exploitation, democracy, revolutionary chaos, dictatorship. Once more, in the great systole and diastole of history, an age of freedom ended, and an age of discipline began.